vulnerability for anxiety and depression overlaps quite substantially, which is why we see not only symptoms of anxiety and depression in the same person, but typically in the same families as well.
This condition, is it easily treated?
Yes, that's the exciting bit. And that's also, for me, the frustrating part, that we have so many people who continue to experience these symptoms when we actually know how to treat it.
Gosh, isn't that wonderful?
What's the first step towards treatment? Is it going to your GP?
The first step to treatment is actually recognising that there's something wrong in the first place, right? So that you know to go and do something about it. And I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent. Our researchers realise that that's one of the big barriers to helping older people to access treatment, is actually recognising that there's something wrong and that they should do something about it, all right? So there are attitudes that we all have about older people and older people have themselves that sort of expect that it's normal to be a bit nervy when you're old, to be a bit flat, to just want to sit at home on the lounge, to not have any motivation. And we sort of normalise what are actually signs and symptoms of some anxiety and depression.
And that can be aided and abetted by family members. Oh, that's just Pop, he's always like that. Or, oh, Nana, she gets cranky.
That's exactly right. So family and friends normalise it. They don't go, hey, Pop's cranky. Being cranky is actually a sign of depression. I wonder if I need to tap Pop on the shoulder and say, hey, are you okay? You're a bit cranky. Should we do something about it, right? So we have this normalising from family and friends. Older people themselves, if they do notice the symptoms, tend to blame it on their age or blame it on their circumstances, like my health is suffering, or it's because now, my kids have all moved out and my wife and I don't get along as well as we used to. So, of course I'm cranky. But unfortunately, we know that professionals, and psychologists included in this, as well as GPs, tend to also normalise and dismiss these symptoms for those same reasons.
Is the treatment, generally speaking, medication tablets, or is it, sitting with a psychologist for days on end? And I don't mean it rudely, but I'm just imagining that many over 65-year-olds couldn't think of anything worse than having to sit and talk to someone for a long while.
Oh, we are lovely people, psychologists.
I know you are.
Actually, it's often the opposite. So speaking candidly, older people are much more difficult to keep to the agenda of a therapy session than younger people, because they have so much to tell, right? They have so many stories and so many examples. In fact, we often find the opposite. Older people are actually thrilled and happy to talk about their circumstances.
So that's a form of therapy in itself, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. But in terms of the intervention, so our clinical guidelines tell us that there are basically two ways that we can treat anxiety and depression. So one is through medication. The other is through psychological interventions. And both of those strategies have been shown to be effective. But the guidelines recommend mostly that a psychological intervention would be applied first. And that is the same for other age groups as well. And the reason being that in older adults in particular, adding medications is often problematic, because often older people are already experiencing some medications for health conditions, right, whether it be cholesterol or heart or whatever it might be. And so it's not helpful to keep adding medications, because obviously drugs and drug interactions occur. So both of them are acceptable, but when you ask a lot of older people, their preference is to have psychological interventions. And one of the barriers that has been noted for why older people don't tell their GPs that they're experiencing depression is because they're afraid of being given another pill. Now, of course, it's each to their own. Some people are happy to do that, some are not. But I guess our guidelines tell us that we have two good options available to people, but we do know that the medications seem to be prescribed more readily than psychological interventions. And that comes back to those attitudes I was talking about before. Those attitudes from practitioners that normalise symptoms, but as well as that, there's some attitudes from practitioners that older people won't do as well with psychologists because, they've had a lifelong period of thinking like this, or they've been pessimistic like this for 40 years, as if they can change.
Is there a preventative side to this? Can you prevent it from happening? What would be the advice, particularly for our listeners who are in this age group and in this category, what should they do to delay the onset of anxiety or depression?
Oh, and even prevent it completely. They don't even have to have it, Lex.
That'd be great.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know, some people have that vulnerability, and those people have often experienced symptoms of anxiety and depression previously in their life, all right? And so these symptoms are often what we call episodic. They come on during stressful periods of life. Other people have never had these symptoms, and we wouldn't expect that they would necessarily would. But when they do come on, it's often because they're triggered by some significant stress, whether it be a major health challenge that means that they can't do the things they used to do, whether it be a relationship challenge like a separation or a divorce or maybe even a death of a relative, okay? So we can't really prevent stresses from happening in life, but we can definitely change the way we interact with stresses, and just general good health advice actually goes a long way to preventing symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we know you're more likely to get anxiety and depression if you're not sleeping well, if you're not doing any physical activity, right? If your diet is poor and you're drinking too much alcohol. But actually the research over the last few years has really focused on the role of social connections as being critically important for mental health. All right. The Harvard longitudinal study that has followed older people for long periods of time found the single thing that predicts whether you're a happy person at age 80 is how many friends you have at age 50.
Oh, really?
Right?
Wow.
And that's because when you are connected with your friends, right, when you're socializing with other people, it brings these enormous mental health benefits. It helps you to deal with any of those stresses that do come your way in life, right? It makes you feel important as a person. And so more and more we're realizing that for older people, we need to keep them actively engaged socially. We need to make sure they maintain the friendships and relationships they've got, but actually also make new ones. Right? There's no reason why you can't make a new bestie at 80.
We have a mantra here at Baby Boomers Guide, and it's get connected and stay connected. But I'm just wondering, Viviana, this happens with a lot of creative people. They choose and they like being loners. Is that necessarily or always unhealthy?
No. Because different people do have different amount of social interaction that they like, all right? But the point is we should all still have some social interaction.
Right.
And in fact, what we know is it's the quality of the social interaction that's more important than the quantity.
Uh-huh.
All right? So there are lots of people who can be busy socially, but they're not really feeling that connection where they feel mutual respect, supported by the other person, where they feel like they can share their concerns and listen to concerns, where they actually feel like they're being valued in a relationship. And those are the relationships we need to make sure we foster in later life. And interestingly, those relationships don't actually just have to come from family. And in fact, it seems like it might be better for people's mental health when they come outside the family.
What about the perceived stigma associated with anxiety and depression, which, of course, if it can just serve as a compounding agent to increasing it. So how do our listeners overcome that sense of stigma?
Well, the good news about stigma is that it seems that with every sort of generation, stigma is actually lessening. So, 20, 30 years ago, we had the men don't cry, older people definitely wouldn't talk about mental health. But the newer generations, I guess, are much more open to talking about mental health and much more motivated to try and do something actively to prevent mental health. So I think, stigma, the way we can reduce stigma is just by having conversations about mental health, reminding everyone that it is normal to experience these symptoms at some point. Like we've all had some times where we've been down, where we felt anxious, and just recognising that it's okay to ask for help. And the quicker we can help people who need help, the quicker the symptoms resolve.
So men's sheds are a pretty good idea, huh?
Oh, they are wonderful. They're wonderful. All of those social groups are wonderful. And not every group is for every person, right? We can't just sort of bundle older people up and put them in a group and say